Hajime mashite, marhaba, and welcome back to Adventures in Language. I'm your guide, Emily. And in this video, I'm going to share with you 8 tips for providing your language students with better corrective feedback. And that's a term which means exactly like what it sounds. Feedback given for the purposes of correcting errors. And as always, if you're new here and you'd like to make sure you're up to date on all of our awesome language content, join the Mango fam by hitting that subscribe button. And without further ado, let's get to it. Now, for all of my language teacher friends out there watching, I'm going to bet that you put in a lot of time and effort into providing thoughtful feedback for your language learners. The problem is, it can be really frustrating when your students aren't showing the progress. They aren't growing and learning from that feedback in the way that you'd hope. The good news is, there are actually some very simple ways to make your feedback more effective. So, that's what I'm going to share with you today. To get us started, let's try something. I want you to think back to a time when you were in class, this could be a language class or some other subject matter, and a teacher identified an error that you made and corrected you on it. Now, can you remember what was the error that you made? How did the teacher go about correcting it? Was their feedback helpful? In what ways was it maybe not helpful? Okay, hold on to that memory and we'll come back to it at the very end of the video. Now, let's dive into the tips that are going to help you optimize your corrective feedback for your students. Okay, tip number 1, prioritize your feedback. Sometimes less is actually more. This is especially true for the written feedback that we give our students, although it also applies to the oral feedback as well. But we've all been there. We provide feedback that ends up with way too much red ink, too many scattered comments, and the problem is that can serve to really overwhelm the learner. And it's costly to your time, let's be honest. The solution here is to prioritize your feedback. So you tell the learner what's the most important thing they should take away. For example, let's say you've just read a student's essay, and the first thing that you want to do is go through and make up a bunch of comments. Instead, the first thing you should do is write a summary that identifies the main 3 or 4 areas of improvement that the student needs to know about. And then your goal is to avoid adding a plethora of specific sentence level comments throughout the body of the essay. Instead, just simply circle the associated problem areas without specifying what it is that they need to do exactly to fix each of those problem areas. That's going to be up to the learner. So in this way, prioritizing your feedback actually accomplishes 2 things. 1, it encourages students to engage in that self-directed critical thinking. And 2, it allows you to be more efficient with your time. Okay, tip number 2, feedback first, grade later. Feedback first, grade later. To make sure your students actually read your feedback, provide it before you assign grades. Okay, think about this. If you're only providing feedback after assigning students their grades, there's less incentive for them to thoroughly read through it and internalize it, right? So for example, you could set up your assignment structure such that students always submit, let's say, a rough draft before their final papers. And then you grade that rough draft for completion only. Now that part's important because then they incorporate that feedback into their final submissions, which is where they get their final grade for the assignment. And you can do this for exams too by having a practice exam before the actual exam. Now, formative low-stakes assignments like this that are graded for completion only can really help reduce student grade anxiety, which can in turn promote a culture of joy in the language learning process. And here is my absolute favorite thing about this tip. Doing this might even encourage your students to get a little more adventurous with the target language. For example, they're more likely to try out complex grammar and new vocabulary, which makes them more likely to have errors because they're not worried that by trying something more adventurous, they might get docked points. So, feedback first, grade later. Tip number 3, maintain a timely turnaround. This one we all know. Delayed feedback is counterproductive to the language learning process because it allows student errors to become entrenched. We all know this one. It's as obvious as it is well documented in the language learning research. Students submit an assignment or an exam, and in an ideal world, you plan to get it back to them the following day. The problem is that your personal life and your work life present many competing demands on your time. So to help you with that, here are 2 suggestions for maintaining a timely turnaround. Suggestion 1, put that grading/feedback time on your calendar so that it's protected time. If that doesn't quite work for you, consider suggestion number 2, which is implement online quizzes that provide students with automatic feedback. Pro tip here, you can even curate the whole quiz experience for them such that when they select an incorrect answer, they get a short text description that explains why it's incorrect and how to fix it. Tip number 4, never underestimate the power of positive feedback. Positive and negative feedback are both critical to the learning process. Together, they increase student efficacy that results from the positive feedback. Things like, wow, that's an impressive vocabulary word that you used, while also encouraging learner growth. And that part comes from the negative feedback, right? Things like, that's the wrong verb conjugation there. In theory, this tip should be such an easy one to implement, but it's also very easy to forget once you're in the thick of grading and providing that feedback. It's really easy to get in the mode of, for example, finding things that the student needs to fix, as opposed to identifying the things that they're already doing really well. Now, to keep yourself accountable with this tip, with providing that positive feedback, try putting a sticky note on your computer that says start positive. That way, while you're grading and providing feedback, you always see that sticky note. There you go. Easy fix. Start positive. Tip number 5, address common errors together in class. So not all errors are specific to individual students. Why not share those common errors out with the class? Post-test debriefs are a great way to do this, and you can even help illustrate key learning points for your students by showing them some data. For example, you could say something like, hey, 75% of you got question number 4 wrong on the exam. Can you tell me why? How would you fix it? Now, a fun in-class assignment that pairs really well with this practice of doing a post-test debrief is having students create future exam questions that focus on addressing the common errors they collectively experienced on the exam. Creating those questions will actually accomplish 2 things. First, it helps them internalize the learning points. And second, here's the bonus, it can actually provide you as the teacher with ideas for future questions on other exams in the next academic year. Though if you do go that second route, make sure to give students the option to opt in or opt out of having their submission considered, because it is kind of their intellectual property. So far, these tips have focused mostly on written corrective feedback. But what about oral corrective feedback? That brings me to tip number 6. Get meta with your oral feedback methods. At the beginning of the semester, try telling your students exactly how you'll be providing them with oral feedback in class. There's no need to keep it a secret from them. Sharing your methodology with them helps them build those metacognitive skills that we really want students to have, and it allows them to take the wheel with their own language learning journey. Doing this also demonstrates to them that you're intentional with the feedback you give, which can help to build that collective trust. For example, I like to add a section in my syllabus that outlines my feedback methods. One strategy you'll notice me using often in class is recasting, which means I'll repeat something that you've said, but subtly correct the error that you've made. For example, in English, a student might say, yesterday I waved at he. And then as a teacher, I might say, oh, yesterday you waved at him. I really like this tip because it allows students to feel like you as a teacher are letting them peer behind the curtain of the teacher-student learning process. And you're kind of in a way showing them your tricks, and that's empowering to them because now they know what to look for, what to listen for in class in order to get the most out of it. Tip number 7, encourage your students to play teacher. In other words, encourage student-to-student feedback. We all know that we as the teachers aren't the only ones in the room that can contribute useful knowledge. And we also know that when students can help each other, they get to feel a sense of accomplishment. One way that you can encourage that student-to-student feedback in your class is by implementing regular peer review into your class structure. In addition, you could also ask students to submit a short little paragraph or cover letter with their final essays or projects that explains how they incorporated the feedback they got from their peers into their final submission. Doing this will help them reinforce the corrective feedback that they got. Plus, sometimes hearing corrective feedback from a friend or a classmate, it just hits different than hearing it from the teacher. So my advice, lean into the varied expertise in your classroom. Okay, here's our last tip, guys. Tip number 8, manage your expectations about student progress. Now, remember, progress takes time, and it also takes a healthy amount of failure, forgetting, misremembering, stumbling. Just because a student keeps forgetting that same vocabulary word or because they seem to keep making the same grammar mistakes doesn't mean they're not learning. And it also doesn't mean that you're a bad teacher. Those learning points are likely marinating in the student's mind, and that can take some time. After all, cognitive science has shown us that the process of forgetting, of remembering, making mistakes, and learning from them can actually help solidify information in our memory. So the point here is that learning a language is a complicated process, and your students will get there bit by bit. And now that we've gotten through all 8 tips, I hope you feel really inspired to take them and try implementing them in your classroom. But big disclaimer here, I don't think that you need to implement all 8 at one time. Actually, I'd recommend that you just pick your favorite 2 to 3 tips, the ones that resonated with you the most, and run with those. This is because not every tip that I share with you is gonna necessarily work for your teaching style or the format in which you give class. So use whatever works for you. Well, we did cover a lot of information, so let's review those 8 tips one last time. Tip number 1, prioritize your feedback. Tip number 2, feedback first, grade later. Tip number 3, maintain a timely turnaround. Tip number 4, never underestimate the power of positive feedback. Tip number 5, address common errors together in class. Tip number 6, get meta with your oral feedback methods. Tip number 7, encourage students to play teacher. And tip number 8, manage your expectations about student progress. And one last thing, before we wrap up, do you remember earlier when I asked you to recall a memory about a time a teacher gave you corrective feedback? Well, given the tips that you've learned today, how might that teacher have improved the way that they gave you that corrective feedback? Or perhaps you think they actually nailed it. Either way, just imagine how much better we as teachers would be if we all took this time that you just took with me today to reflect on our past experience as students and apply new knowledge to better serve our students today. So go you awesome, awesome teacher. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, please let us know by hitting that like button and subscribing to the channel. And remember, if you have a question or an idea for a video that you'd like to see from us, let us know. We're always listening. Well, my language teaching enthusiasts, that's all for this video. Sayonara, mae salame, and I look forward to seeing you here next time. Bye. Oh hey, it's me again. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to get your free Setting Good Goals worksheet, which you can access through the link in the description. In next week's video, we're talking about the fluency illusion, what every teacher should know about it and why. If you want to be the first to know when that video is released, then subscribe to the channel and go ahead and ring that notification bell. Well, my fellow teachers, I'll see you in the next video. Bye.